PM2.5, NOx, and secondary pollutant ozone. And we mentioned about critical loads and critical levels. So today I want to spend this lecture just going into the impacts of NOx pollution. And I think from when I was talking, hopefully you got the idea that when I was talking about critical loads, that we are talking about substantial amounts of nitrogen, nutrient nitrogen, that's being sourced from air pollution and that's going into our ecosystems and being taken up by our plants and being breathed in by us. If you ask somebody to talk about or list, with my thing, the main drivers for biodiversity loss, the main cause, if I said to you what are the main causes of biodiversity loss, I'm sure a lot of you will come up with change in land use, deforestation, forest burning, yeah, impact on biodiversity. You might mention climate change, causing extinction of a million species, the last prediction. You might come up with rising atmospheric carbon dioxide, in relation to climate change. Maybe very few of you will actually come up with nitrogen deposition. But as this major publication that came out in Science, it was very, very influential at the time, listed nitrogen deposition as one of its top 5 drivers for biodiversity loss. Okay. And this graph here shows different ecosystems, biomes from the Arctic, alpine, boreal, lakes, streams, tropical rainforests, different areas, and shows which of the different drivers are responsible for the major changes in biodiversity. And number 3, nitrogen deposition, in some areas, maybe not in the Arctic, but in the alpine, for example, the alpine areas, nitrogen deposition is one of the top drivers for biodiversity loss. Very, very sensitive environment to any increases in nitrogen. And in fact, the paper quotes, one of the major drivers of biodiversity loss in Europe is atmospheric deposition of nitrogen. And the unit for deposition of nitrogen is kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. Okay? Which is a really, if you think about that, it's a big unit for air pollution, invisible air pollution. So what's NOx? So we use the term NOx because there's 2 major forms of nitrogen oxides, nitrogen dioxide and nitrogen oxide. And they are both exist at the same time in different amounts depending on the conditions at any one time, depending on how efficient your car is, the engine is, or what's ever producing it. So very quickly, there's an interconversion between NO2 and NO in the atmosphere, depending on light levels and how much you're emitting from your source. So very often we talk about nitrogen pollution, air pollution, as NOx, to take to a credit that in fact it's a mixture of NO2 and NO. But usually the NO2 is much, much higher levels than there are NO. NO only exists a very short period of time before it's converted to NO2. But NO is very more phytotoxic, toxic to plants, than NO2. But luckily it doesn't usually exist for very long in the environment. So you'll see people referring to NOx. So when you read papers on nitrogen-containing pollutants, have a look, see whether they're talking about ammonia, which you'll be talking about with agriculture, Are they talking about NO2? Are they talking about NOx, which is the combined of the two pollutants? So let's have a look at what sort of emissions we've got of NOx in the UK. There's an interactive map. Again, go onto these links, have a play around to see what the NOx emissions are in the different areas. But basically I've pulled up, as I said, there's inventories every year that come out to tell us how much of these emissions are taking place. In the latest report in 2017, emissions have dropped since the 70s by 72%. So this is the emissions of NOx since 1970. And you can see they've dropped quite considerably. A lot of it's to do with cleaning up the power stations, the fossil fuel burning power stations. And what's left, as you can see here, a lot of it's to do with transport. So these are the sources at the bottom. And, you know, this is good news since the 1990s. Up until the 1990s, all the problems around acid rain. Not many of you born before the 1990s here. But in my early career, it was all about acid rain. And there was such a worry about it. A lot of the power stations were put in scrubbers. We did a lot to clean up the NOx. And as I mentioned in my last lecture, the levels have dropped a lot, but if you look over the last few years, they're levelling off. Now on this graph, there's two dotted lines. One of them's the Gothenburg commitment that we have to reach by 1919, and we've reached our commitment for that, for emissions in the UK. And they revised the commitment downwards for 2020, which the questions are we going to meet our next commitment for NOx emissions? So this is emissions, how much we produce. So from road transport, it's fallen by 25%, and we need to do more before we hit our commitment for 2020, moving on. And the worry is how we're going to do that. And for a long time, people were thinking, well, why isn't the level of NOx going down? We know how many cars are on the road, we can do the calculations and the modelling, and the levels of NOx were still high. It weren't coming down as fast as we wanted. There was a downward trend because we were replacing older vehicles. New fleets, new cars coming in, more efficient cars, more stricter emissions. But as we were swapping into diesel cars, less PM10s, but they produce more NOx than petrol cars. And also, it turned out this defeat device, I'm sure you all read the news about this, didn't you? Yeah, I don't need to go into what happened here. Anybody? You know what I'm talking about? Nod? Yes? No? That it turned out that a lot of the companies, BMW and a few others as well, had a defeat device, so they were cheating the system. They were testing them under conditions which reduced their NOx emissions on the rollers and producing them and putting them out on the road. But in normal road conditions, they were producing much more. And they had a software cheat in their system when they were testing their engines in cars. So in fact, the air pollution modelers were using the wrong figures for what the diesel cars, these new cars, were producing. Because we knew theoretically by calculating what the emissions should be, but it wasn't the decreases in concentrations wasn't matching. And now we know why. So hopefully, going forward, with the stricter requirements and tests and keeping an eye on what's happening, hopefully things will start moving downwards again in terms of emissions. NOx has three different major effects. Health effects, again, I'm not going to talk about these, but I don't want to leave them out. As I said, they can cause inflammation of the airways. If you get very peaks, you know, during the rush hour, You can get peaks 200, 300 micrograms per metre cubed. And unfortunately, when the NOx is combined with the PM10s, which they usually are, you don't usually just get NOx because you've got the cars, road transport producing a whole mixture of pollutants. You've got more than additive effects. It's a synergistic effect of the PM10s and also the NOx as well, which is phytotoxic. Environmental effects. Well, I've already mentioned before that ozone is produced by the reaction of NOx pollution in the presence of light. So you get ozone in the high levels in the summer, not today. So you've got the problem with it reacting with the VOCs. You know what VOCs are? Volatile organic compounds, yeah, which are also produced by cars and road transport. So you get this mix, put sunlight in, and you get ozone out of the end, which is more phytotoxic than what you started with. And we're going to go into that later, my next lecture on ozone. And as I said, typical levels on a busy road above 400 micrograms per metre cubed. And if you go back to the lecture before, there's a lot of cross-checking across lectures here. One of the tables I told you that one of the objectives for NOx is 30 micrograms per metre cubed in the air. And this is why, because above these levels you get an injury. And unfortunately, a lot of the roads in the UK and across Europe are above the levels. So again, if we look at the maps, this one on the left is the nitrogen dioxide concentration. So this is how much is in the air in micrograms per metre cubed. You can pick out the large conurbations, you can pick out the M6 and the M1. So around the urban major roads you have much higher levels of NOx than you have in other areas. If you look across the whole of the UK in terms of background NOx, again you can still see the high levels from the roads in Liverpool and London. And this concentrations map onto where the major emissions are taking place. It's not to remember to say that NOx is only found near where it's emitted or produced. NOx is just like any other gas, it can travel. So that's a problem. If you've just got point sources like a factory or a particular area that's using lots of HGVs, NOx can also build up next to the road, but it can also travel further away. And two of the papers you're going to read for the last lecture talk about how much impact takes place as you move away from the road. How far do you have to walk away from the road or have your house on the road before you get to a reasonable level of NOx. As I said, I mentioned critical loads. So for vegetation, if we want to know whether that concentration of NOx and the deposition of that NOx is high enough to cause injury, we need to look at what that habitat looks like and decide and find out what its critical load is. How much nitrogen can that habitat cope with? As I said, there's a whole list of them. If you go to this PDF here, it lists all various ecosystems down. You can choose the one that you want. So this is just some of them. And you can see for bogs and fen habitats, so the Peak District outside Manchester, the range critical load is 5 to 10 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. All right? So in other words, it's very sensitive, because if you look at, let's choose another one that's higher, grasslands, semi-dry calcareous grasslands. So if you're from Kent, from the Chalk Downs, anywhere like that, where it's very chalky grasslands, they can cope with 15 to 25 kilograms per hectare per year of nitrogen falling on them. So they're less sensitive to the nitrogen load. It's not to say that there's no impact. If the levels go above that, 15 to 25, you get, in other words, the exceedances I was telling you about in the last lecture, you have impacts. So if you look at the bogs, you get increases in vascular plants if you have high nitrogen loads. And I'm going to go into this and give you some examples in a minute. a change in the composition, you might not, unless you know your plant ID, you might not think there's much of an effect. But if you got down on your hands and knees with a quadrant and actually ID'd the plants in an area which has high nitrogen deposition compared to one that has low, you'll probably find that the actual species that you find is different. In other words, you very often get more grasses than you do anything else, because grasses love nitrogen. And there's other species that don't like nitrogen, and they'll be outcompeted by the grasses. So you get a change in mix. And for years, people think, well, this nitrogen from air pollution and roads is not really having an effect. It's only when plant scientists and ecologists went and had a closer look. So actually, there is. It might not look it to the naked eye. You might not have all plants that are dying, but the actual species that are present is changing. And then when you get to things like mosses and lichens, in fact, most of them are down even lower than 5. They are very sensitive to any nitrogen input from the air. Can anybody guess why? Anybody know anything about ferns and mosses? Where do they get their nutrients from? Anybody know? Any plant scientists in this? From where? The atmosphere. From the atmosphere, exactly. Well done. So, especially mosses and lichens, they don't really have roots, so they absorb all their nutrients in the rainwater from the air. So we're saying, you know, very often there's 5, 10, 20, depending on what part of the country you are, kilograms of nitrogen. So, and lichens and mosses, if you think about where they grow, in the Peak District and bogs, very low nitrogen environments. And suddenly we're coming along and tipping all this nitrogen on them, and they don't like it. So lichens and ferns and mosses, very, very sensitive to nitrogen, increase in nitrogen. And on average, people have calculated that over the UK, we're getting over 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. So you can see, looking down this critical load nutrient nitrogen range, they've upped here. Lots of these ecosystems, 20 is at the top or over the top across the UK. So this, every so often I put a little summary slide in so that it sort of summarises what I've just been saying. Deposition of nitrogen has changed very little. Yeah, still getting lots of deposition of nitrogen. It's adverse effects. If you go back to that table, I'll give you some examples of the adverse effects, just like changing competition, and I'll give you some more examples in a minute. And it can have a significant impact on species richness. So again, you might not notice, you think, well, that looks a very healthy area, but then you're going to have a closer look and it's all one species. Whereas actually in normal conditions it would be a mix of species. So there'll be subtle changes. So if you look at those exceedance maps for nitrogen, so these are the latest ones that have just been released. So this is nutrient nitrogen, and this, I'm not going to go into explain why they show acidity, but nitrogen also has an acidic impact if it's in rainwater. But you can see in many areas across the UK exceeding the critical load for that particular habitat. Some of them 14 kilograms per year above the critical load. So that's above. So let's say we're in a woodland, the critical load is 15 to 20 kilograms. And then they're getting more than that. They're actually getting 34 kilograms per hectare. It's way over their critical load. So you might think, well, I give my house plants baby bio, you know, feed them in the nitrogen, and more nitrogen is better. But in natural or semi-natural habitats, in fact, a lot of these have adapted to low nitrogen environments. It's the only environment that really is high nitrogen is agricultural, like crops, where we've bred our crops to take up luxury nitrogen, so they produce lots of yield. But natural and semi-natural environments, most of them are low in nitrogen, so they don't like lots of nitrogen. And I know I'm mainly UK because that's where it's very easy to get all this data. If you look at the EU, there's different trends. There's areas across the EU where exceedance of critical loads is very high. So it's not just a UK problem. That's all I just put that in for. It's just not us. And I'm sure worldwide as well, nutrient nitrogen is a real issue in terms of ecosystems. So the trends in what's happening with our critical loads. This is the latest data that they reckon that 80% of our nitrogen-sensitive habitats, the critical loads exceeding them. Remember, so as soon as anybody says critical loads exceeded, that means there's a potential for injury. It's above the threshold that they can sustain and cope with. Right? 80% of the sensitive habitats, that's calcareous grasslands, our chalk grasslands, managed beach, these are very, very sensitive environments, so they are getting a lot of extra nitrogen. It's not all bad. Some of them, the levels of exceedances have dropped. For unmanaged beach woodland, if you really want to be specific, it's halved from 1996 to 2016. So I don't want to get the impression that it's getting worse necessarily. All I'm saying is that we seem to be not getting much better either. We seem to have reached a plateau. So it's not as bad as it used to be, but it's still bad. That's my main message. And 86% of designated sites in England, Wales, Northern Ireland exceed the critical loads for one or more of their areas. So that's sort of the bottom line. Yeah. So it's a huge area here which is exceeding their critical loads. I think I've hit that enough. So what's happening then? If they're exceeding their critical loads, what are the impacts? What would we see? I've already said one, and I'm going to go into more. This one is a very useful review. 2011, it's getting a bit old now, but it's a really good summary review paper, so I thoroughly recommend you read it. It puts into context a lot of things I've been talking about, but in a European setting. Yeah. So we've got NOx, contributes to smog, so that's our breathing, affects human health, I'm not going to go into that, reacts with ozone, and we're going to talk about ozone next. I've said it's transboundary, it's mobile, it's an air pollutant, so it's not, when it gets up into the high atmosphere, it can travel to other countries. We can get European NOx, we can send our NOx to Sweden, so you've got high-level transport of NOx. It affects vegetation, which I'm going to give you some examples, and it can also act as acid rain. So NOx dissolves in rainwater, it produces acids, and then the acids can have an effect on buildings, your lungs, and vegetation as well. So the impacts are really diverse, and I can't really go into every single one, there's so many, but you've got the direct effects of this nitrogen gas. So high level, if it's really high levels, you can get visible injury on the leaves. They start bleaching and dying and going brown. So you can get this direct effect when it's very high. Visible symptoms of damage, so right next to the road. You know, there's some species you just would not see next to a road because they just would not be able to survive. You've got the effects on the soil, so all this nitrogen is going into the soil, so you're getting more nitrogen in the soil, and then the plants take up the nitrogen through the soil, so that they have too much nitrogen, so they grow too soft and big. You know, you can give plants too much nitrogen. So you can have a direct effect on the leaves, you can have indirect through the soil, taking up nitrogen that way. It can cause the plants to be more susceptible to other stresses. So if you give your household plant too much baby bio, too much nitrogen and phosphate, they grow too much, but then if it gets cold, they'll be much more sensitive to cold. So they get more sensitive to other stresses. And I've mentioned D, competitive, changing the competitive relationship, and I'm going to show you some photos that illustrate that. and then the changes in species composition, so this switch to grasses, which is one of the first things that people really noticed in terms of competitiveness. And if you look down the sides of roads and things like that, very often it's the grasses that are doing really well. And then the reduction in species richness. So the two papers I've given you to read give you direct illustration of these changes in lichens, mosses, grasses. So that's why I've given you them, because they're your example of the general things I'm talking about. You've got acidification of the soils and the water, which I'm not going to go into, but you will be aware of that. Increased nitrate leaching, so you've heard about eutrophication from fertilisers, increase in fertilisers, but the increase in all this kilograms of nitrogen from air pollution also goes into the soil and can be leached away. So it can increase effects of eutrophication from an atmospheric gas. It's not just from fertilisers. Okay? And I've mentioned the direct effect on mosses and lichens, which years ago, the first thing people did was notice the reduction in the lichens in trees in their cities, on the side of the trees. And that's because they're so sensitive, it's one of the first things that people noticed. So what's happening in this species composition, which is the much more subtle, but also can be the most significant change? People think air pollution, dead plant. But in fact, that doesn't very often happen. It's more these subtle changes that are causing impacts on our environment. So you've got nitrogen deposition, and then I always think of the moors outside Manchester, peat moorland, bogs, that type of area. If you think about that, slow-growing plants, small plants, not big trees, low rates of nitrogen cycling in the soil, quite acidic, high species richness. If you go and put your quadrat down, there's a lot of species there, but maybe you might not notice. And that's ticking along quite nicely, laying down its bogs, sphagnum, and low nitrogen, quite happy. Everything's adapted to low nitrogen environment, slow growing. We come along and deposit our 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, and then if you go and have a look at those environments, you start getting displacement to sparse growing grasses and herbs, high rates of cycling. You start picking up leaching of nitrogen off the area, low species richness, species start to disappear. And that's what happened to sphagnum moss outside Manchester when we used to have a lot of air pollution from Manchester, from all the factories. And the sphagnum moss disappeared a lot from the moors outside Manchester. It was really devastating. They've started to come back now because we've started to clean up our environment, and it was all because of nitrogen deposition. And then so you can move from this particular environment to this one, and this can happen very quickly within a few years. But to go back from here, there you go. To go back from this state to this state is nigh impossible. Really, really difficult. Once that nitrogen's there, once those other species have invaded, it's very, very difficult. It takes a long, I haven't even seen centuries maybe to get back to this type of environment. Very hard. Maybe even need to go out and transplant and put them, actively restore that ecosystem. It wouldn't happen naturally if we just stopped adding nitrogen. And that's the problem. So this is examples of people that actually, well, can we do this? Can we mimic this in an experiment? So they started off here, species-rich chalk grassland, beautiful, orchids, clovers, nice mix of species. You go along, they've added quite a lot, 100 kilograms of nitrogen, so very, very high levels. You might want to try a bit little. But even at that, after 3 years of going and watering and adding the nitrogen to that environment and doing nothing else, you end up with this. Mainly those grasses that just soak up nitrogen as much as you can give them. 3 years. And then you can look at, this is nitrogen deposition. So remember I mentioned 5, 10, 15, 20. A lot of ecosystems can survive 15 to 20. Some of the more sensitive ones, 5 to 10. And if you look at these dune grasslands, you can see as the increase in the nitrogen deposition, the number of species that you find decreases. I've shown this because this is a really famous experiment, because it was a European-wide, they repeated the experiment, exactly the same experiment in all these different countries. Yeah, and they found the same. And they showed that big loss here in this dune grassland was 5 to 10. So anything above that, the species lost. And there was one species lost for every 2.5 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare added. So it's very, very sensitive to any nitrogen. They did a study in Sweden, added a bit more realistic, maybe 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. They did it for 4 years, and this area had a critical load of about 10. So they wanted to, see, well, what happens if it was well above the critical load? And you can see they lost a lot of these bushes, the juniper bushes, and they ended up in a completely different understory in this particular area. So it proved that, this amount of nitrogen that the ecosystems are getting are having a really major effect. I had some friends that actually showed this in the UK. They looked at Calluna, which is a heather, which is a plant, heather moorlands. It likes low nitrogen environments. And what they did, they actually, over 7 years, they went and watered these plots. There's my friend out there, part of his PhD, going out and watering these plots with nitrogen, ammonium nitrate. And they saw that the frequency of damage on these Calluna went up as you put more and more nitrogen in them. And interestingly, they lost, a bit sad really, but they lost their funding. So after 7 or 8 years, they stopped watering these areas. And then they went back and they thought, hold on a minute, let's go back and see what's happened to those plots when we've not been adding all this extra nitrogen. Have they recovered? And they found that even 8 years after all that extra nitrogen, they were still picking up the effects of the nitrogen that had been added 8 years before. So you remember I said it's very quick to go one way, very slow to recover. And especially the lichens hadn't recovered, and the phrenology. So heathlands are very, very sensitive, one of the ecosystems that are very, very sensitive to nitrogen. And in East Anglia, they've already shown there's large areas that have lost their Calluna, their heather, because of all this extra nitrogen. So 4 important facts to remember from all this blurb I'm talking about. Most of the UK and most of Europe received biologically significant amounts of nitrogen from the air. All right? Maybe if you don't remember all the figures, you just know it's a big issue. The Pennines, places like that, they get a lot of rain near large urban areas, lots of traffic, get some of the heaviest loads in the UK. And the rates of deposition, again, if you can't remember the numbers, but just remember that it's approaching those and sometimes exceeding those that farmers use to fertilise their fields, which is quite a thing to think about when you think about it. So I'm not going to go, obviously not going to go into all these processes because we'll be here forever and a day, but some of these I've already mentioned briefly. Look, increased nitrogen deposition and concentration, increases their sensitivity to stress factors. It's got direct toxicity. Stress factor increases their susceptibility to pathogens and herbivores. Okay? Changes competition, changes soil acidification. I haven't even gone on to this because this is soil and that's not my area, but Richard Bargett and people like that are working in this area. Yeah? And all has impacts, negative impacts on species richness. So there's lots and lots of routes where you get a change in species richness and species composition. Site of action. Right, so I've just been very talking about nitrogen being thrown on these fields from the air, from our transport. So what happens when it hits the leaf? What happens to these plants? Me and you, we breathe it in, right? That's our route of action. It comes into our lungs and dissolves on the apoplast plants, on the alveoli, the water in our lungs, produces acids, we produce mucus, from breathing, your alveoli close and all this type of stuff, right? I'm not a biomed, so, but that's basically it. But for plants, they breathe it in, but they take it in through their stomata. Yeah? So, no plant scientists here, but plants have stomata, they're pores on their leaves, which water is lost and CO2 goes into the leaf. Well, obviously that's an obvious route for these air pollutants. So when they're taking up CO2, they're also taking in air pollution. They're taking in the NOx, the ozone. The PM10s tend to sit on the leaf. They tend to be a bit bigger than stomata, so the PM10s and particulate matter doesn't go in, but a lot of the gaseous ones do. It also can stay on the leaf surface, but the problem is some of these gases that are breathed, they're taken in, uptake by the leaf. And when it goes into the leaf, it dissolves on the cells inside the stomatal cavity, all round here, and it dissolves to the acids, nitrous and nitric acid. So that can cause pH disruption. If it's really, really high, that's when you get leaf injury. You see the white spots and the black, because actually the pH of the acid is actually killing the cells. Right? Straightforward. This effects of pH can actually affect the functioning of these cells, affect the function of rubisco, the photosynthetic pathways. So that's high concentrations and long term. And don't remember what I said right at the beginning, the problem with air pollution, it's long term. So you might think that plant is quite happy to begin with, but over the years or over the seasons, gradually these changes, pH changes, ultrastructural changes will accumulate. And it might not be an obvious visible injury, but there might be growth reduction. So the trees may be 10-15% smaller than they would be without that pollutant there. So not only is air pollution invisible to us, our eye, sometimes the impact is invisible unless we really get down and make the measurements. So we're not talking about bleaching of leaves. We talk about ozone very often causes visible injury, but the big problem with a lot of these air pollutants is this slow accumulation of damage. However, at very low concentrations, plants can accumulate nitrogen from the air and use it to metabolize to grow. So we know plants can take up nitrogen from the soil, but in fact plants can use this at low concentrations, use this nitrogen from these pollutants, NOx pollutants, as a source of nitrogen, but only at low concentrations. Right, this is where it gets a bit much for one lecture. So this is where I'm thinking of me having these big hands with big fingers on, you know, these you have in football places. Nitrogen dioxide taken up by stomata in the substomatal cavity under the stomata can actually go in through the apoplast, you hear it's dissolving, and be taken up into cells. Okay? So this is the plant using nitrogen from the air. You don't have to worry about all this if you're not really into this sort of thing, but if you are biochemists, I've given you a big review paper here. Not necessarily big, but it'll explain this is happening. And there's two enzymes in nitrogen metabolism in plants, and people have shown that these two enzymes can be upregulated in plants that are exposed to this nitrogen pollution. So on low concentrations, plants can actually take in that nitrogen and grow better. But it's when it goes above its critical load and when it gets really high, that's when you start getting problems. So these are the two enzymes, these two pathways inside the cells that can metabolize the nitrogen. So these are there all the time. They're ones that where plants use nitrogen from the soil. It's just that now the nitrogen's coming through the leaf rather than through the roots, which is a bit of a strange concept. It's called foliar fertilization. Yeah? And what people have shown is that in plants that have been given nitrogen dioxide, so this is, can incorporate the nitrogen, this is from the atmosphere, and you get upregulation of those two enzymes. So in tomato and tobacco, just proof of concept really, that this was happening. You can label the nitrogen dioxide, this is a mass label, and see where it goes. And you can also measure these enzymes and show the upregulate, to show that it's not a passive metabolism. These plants are actually really using this air pollution. And what you can do is relate that to nitrogen deposition. Again, we're going back to deposition. Do you remember? Some of them can cope to 5 to 10, some of them 15 to 20. Well, this paper said, well, all right then, if they're giving that much nitrogen critical load, how much is actually are they using? How much are they of that nitrogen are they using keeping in their foliage? Can we pick up the increase in nitrogen in the leaves? And this is in spruce and Scots pine. And for comparison, in Scots pine, 12 kilograms is their critical threshold here. And you can see, as you increase the amount of nitrogen deposition in Scots pine, the amount of nitrogen in their leaves goes up. All right? Which you might think that's a good idea for a leaf, but above a certain percentage, you start getting injury. So then they get up above their critical loads. So you can get too much of a good thing with the nitrogen. But it does prove that plants can metabolize and take up the nitrogen. So they're not totally passive, just sitting there with all this air pollution just going on them, this NOx going on them. So let's have a key message in case I've lost you all. Nitrogen oxides can impact vegetation through direct foliar damage. So if it's high levels, you can get that changes in pH, right? And susceptibility to secondary stress. Most sensitive are the ones that are adapted to low nutrients, like the peats, the heather, lichens, mosses, that type of thing. They're the most sensitive. And you can get this accumulated load over the years, 7 years, 8 years, keep going, keep going. So the accumulated load year after year is the most important thing, which you would miss if you're not doing those sort of studies. And if you look at the reports from the government and a lot of the things that set up the critical objectives, they miss the point. It doesn't matter that it's not high, even if it's a low load, but year after year after year, all that extra nitrogen being put into these ecosystems, that's the problem. Not necessarily, it has to be very high. So, and people have already been picking up biodiversity decline in Europe and the UK because of this nitrogen. There's loads and loads of evidence now. Probably 20 or 30 years ago, this was a hypothesis, but now we're actually, with accumulated effects, we're starting to see it happening in real life. And as I said, full recovery is going to be very, very slow, if at all. So we could, in some areas, completely lose the type of habitat and the species mix that was there before. Yeah, critical loads in major centre habitats exceeded across the whole of the UK. You'd be hard pushed to find an area that's not been impacted. Yeah, and people have picked up changes in species richness already. And as I've said, they're replaced by species adapted to higher nutrient availability. And might not necessarily be the ones that were native or natural there to begin with. So there might be some habitats that if we carry on that we might not necessarily have or have so much of. But at low levels, some species can gain some beneficial growth. And people have mainly seen this next to roads, and in roadsides and in the middle of the reservations. If you do your study in the reservation of motorways, you find the plants that live there, the ones that like high nitrogen, can grow very happily, and they're actually using that extra nitrogen from the atmosphere as a nitrogen fertiliser. But there's other species you would never be able to survive there because they wouldn't be able to cope with that amount of nitrogen. The reading for the seminar, yeah, bring those papers along and your questions, because that illustrates a lot of the things that I've been telling you, yeah? Yeah.
We bring questions? No.
Yeah, your answers to the questions.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, because
Yeah, bring your answers up.